It's yet another episode of Africa Business Weekly. Hello and welcome to this week's highlights from the world of business across sub-Saharan Africa. I'm Akin Obake. Our spotlight from Nigeria focuses on developments in the aviation sector as foreign airlines trapped funds remain a contentious issue. After that, we have a sit-down with Kenya's finance minister on the country's debt situation, tax regime and inflation. Well, it's time for our first crossing with Palesa. She's on standby to give us some insight from South Africa and discussions that shaped this week. Hello, Palesa.
We are back with yet another week of Pan-African coverage, and we kick off today's episode with Africa's blockchain ecosystem. CNBC Africa's Zanella Morrison spoke to Ernest Mbenkum, who is the founder of Bantu Blockchain Foundation, about addressing the biggest insecurities African businesses face while engaging with blockchain technology and how this is being rectified to make blockchain a safe industry. Let's listen in.
I'm so confident because this technology has been transformative, and particularly the opportunities that it presents for emerging markets when it comes to things like financial inclusion. When you put aside the speculation with cryptocurrencies and other risky assets being sold on these sort of platforms, the underlying technology itself holds a lot of promise. From a security standpoint, lower cost of doing business, tokenizing assets, as we say it, so to speak, and also empowering the youth of Africa to find new avenues for raising funds for their businesses and services. So we look at the long-term play, which goes beyond the volatile assets and cryptocurrencies, and looking more at stable coins and other services and opportunities being built on these platforms.
But it's also seen its fair share of volatility. Do you think this is an important part of the sector of investments? Is it actually a good thing that it's not contained, but is responding to what's happening globally, in the finance market space?
Yes, indeed. The volatility is there. We've seen a lot of shift towards the cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin in response to the liquidity crisis from the Silicon Valley Bank and other issues that are being faced right now. However, we believe that with the rise of more regulation and frameworks and legal frameworks around this, we see that more institutional players and startups and companies will be able to work closer with in a more regulated framework. And we believe that this will bring more stability into the ecosystem, because right now it's been like the Wild West, where there are no regulations to really contain the volatility. But as more adoption happens and governments and regulators come on board, as they are doing, we expect things to be more stable. Yeah.
And that's really been the question, is will regulators help to regulate? And if regulators regulate, people feel more comfortable. Does that, though, affect the attractiveness of cryptocurrencies? So if regulators step in, does it create confidence? Does it create, a lack of confidence because it's getting into the system? And do we see stock exchanges becoming more open to the currency now that we can see some regulatory developments?
Yes, indeed. Obviously, it's a catch-22. In the early days, it wasn't really understood by regulators, but now there's greater awareness. There's a separation between the technology and the volatile assets and speculatory assets, cryptocurrencies. And we can see in places like Nigeria, even here in South Africa, where there are policies being put out by the government to begin to support and ensure that there is proper use of these and proper adoption of these technologies. So we remain very optimistic. And again, in the long-term perspective, this needs to happen. And when you look at a very important aspect like asset tokenization, where you bring real-world assets into the ecosystem, you start to see that exchanges are beginning to take an interest in this. And most recently, I believe the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, mentioned that he sees the future in tokenization, which is, again, linked to blockchain. So they are very optimistic about the future of this technology.
Up next is a story that unpacks Africa's sustainable development goals beyond 2030. To determine the accelerated implementation of AFCFTA, my colleague Godfrey Mutsizwa was joined by Antonio Pedro, who is the acting executive secretary for the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Antonio emphasized the removal of trade barriers and improving the quality of the products traded within the continent. Let's listen in.
And this is a narrative that we are also asking our is a sort of a framework that we are asking our member states to emulate in terms of planning frameworks. We really need to go beyond GDP metrics, look at all of the combination of all of those factors as we define well-being. And that process has to make sure that no one is left behind, small or large scale, informal or formal. So the quality of those conversations, therefore, between all of those stakeholders will determine whether we indeed achieve some of those strategic goals behind the SDGs. Nobody should be left behind.
Without question, without question. And important, of course, that we do not load extra debt onto future generations when we are already heavily indebted. One final point around the AFCFTA and how it fits into all of this. I wanted to understand the context of the conversations that the ministers are having now.
Well, first is really about implementation. Already from the extraordinary summit in Niamey, which had two segments, one which was, of course, on sustainable industrialization and economic diversification. The other one was the review on the state of implementation of CFTA, the need for accelerated implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area was a very loud and clear message. And in any case, you cannot trade if you don't produce. Therefore, the conversation on sustainable industrialization and economic diversification is part and parcel of the conversation on accelerating the implementation of CFTA. The same message, came again out of the ordinary summit that we had just now, the AU Assembly. Theme of the year was also accelerating the implementation of CFTA. Very clear, implementation must be prioritized. Implementation, it could be, underpinned on some of the investments that we've made already, like the 28 or so national CFTA strategies that, together with other partners, we helped to formulate. So it's about implementation. It's also about looking more deeply into the binding constraints to trade, going back to the Boosting Intra-Africa Action Plan and see what is it that we need to prioritize to reducing the obstacles to trade. Some of them has to do with the effort that we need to deploy to domesticating the instruments for us to trade freely on the continent into national laws, regulations, procedures, and so on, informing, among others, customs officers that products X, Y, and Z are already part of that 90% of products that will be traded freely within the continent. So there is a couple of information on payment systems. We're discussing about the need for us to address the macroeconomic convergence criteria that would facilitate the utilization of our own currency to trade. And of course here, as you know, the Afrexim Bank is investing into those payment systems to facilitate intra-African trade. It's about producing more and consuming more, meaning locally, meaning we have to look at issues of quality of the products that we produce, so that then we can change the habits of our consumers. I wanted, because you made reference to debt, I think everyone is conscious that as more countries in Africa fall into the debt trap and the debt distress, we need to look at the global financial architecture.
And that's all from me for now. It's back to you.
Thanks for the update there, Palesa. Up next is some content from the east of the continent with Sarah.
Well, thank you, Akin. As Africa moves to advance its mobility, safety will remain key. This is according to Saeed Dada, head of Global Road Safety Facility at the World Bank, in a conversation with my colleague Eugene Anangwe in Washington, D.C.
As you mentioned, safety is really at the core of transport and mobility in general. But what we are seeing now, there is a really very strong connection between decarbonization and road safety. It's very difficult to decarbonize the transport sector and keep it unsafe. And I can later on give you a bit of example how these two are linked. Now, us at the Global Road Safety Facility, it's a multi-donor trust fund at the World Bank. We are looking at, we've been in existence since 2006. With our main mission really is to build capacity and give technical assistance to developing countries to advance their road safety program and capacity. So the GRSF has been working all over the developing country worlds. We tend to focus a bit on the investment of the multilateral because we have the added advantage being part of the World Bank group. And traditionally, the focus has been mainly on safer roads and safer speed. But recently, we have really brought to our menu of assistance things like safer vehicles, safe and clean vehicles, and this is where also decarbonization and road safety link come into place. We've been also looking at the health effect of this, and also this is where local air pollution come into with road safety. So we've been looking at the whole spectrum of, because road safety is a multi-sectoral issue, so we've been looking at all of that at the Global Road Safety Facility.
Right, and what would you say is your portfolio like in terms of investment within developing countries, and which specific areas of the world, of this part of the world, are you really looking into?
So the bank, the facility has its portfolio across the developing country, but in the last few years, most of our technical assistance has gone to sub-Saharan Africa region. At the moment, we have about 4 or 5 million of active grants going for the region, for sub-Saharan African. But in terms of the World Bank investment, there has been really an increase of the financing of the World Bank in terms of road safety. It used to be in the order of $100 to $200 million per year. But last year, we saw a record of almost $1 billion of road safety investment. And this is due because the World Bank now is looking at road safety as a multi-sectoral, standalone topic, not just an add-on to a transport project. So we are no longer addressing road safety as an add-on to a transport or health project. We are addressing road safety as an integrated approach by itself. So been approving standalone, what we call standalone. And we are really hoping, this started in Argentina, in Vietnam, recently in India and Bangladesh, but now we are into discussion with the governments of West African countries to maybe if we can look at a standalone road safety investment in West Africa.
Yeah, when you put your ears on the ground, what are you hearing from leaders from these countries, African countries like West Africa, like you say? What are they saying? What is their interest, and how do they plan to plug into what you're offering?
So unfortunately, there is a great interest in Africa, but unfortunately the interest is coming at a very high cost, which is the multi-crash fatality that Africa has been having. Recently, as you know, there has been a couple of big bus crashes in Africa that has led to multi-fatalities, 40 fatalities in one of them, 25 in another one. That has really created a bit of high political interest and will. And there has been an interest to working, especially with us, with other global player in this field. So there is the interest is there. However, there are lots of challenges because currently Africa has the highest fatality rate. It's about 26 per 100,000 population. And if you look at the fleet, it's still the motorization is low. But Africa is on a trajectory of very high and rapid motorization. So unless we do something in road safety, we are going to see more and more deaths. There is about 650 people dying on African roads per day, which is about 250,000, 250,000 per year. So the challenges are there, but we know what works and what does not work. We learn from other regions, so we don't need to repeat the mistake as we motorize. But the challenges are definitely there because of the motorization, the development. Everybody now at some point is going to buy a car or buy a motorcycle. So we need to make sure also as Africa motorizes, it motorizes in a green and safe. And this is really what this forum this week has been about, how to have a green and inclusive mobility.
Finally, CNBC Africa's Tessie Kavan caught up with the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury and Economic Planning in Kenya, Professor Njuguna Ndungu, for a conversation on the country's debt situation, tax regime, as well as the cost of living and inflation.
Inflation and high cost of living is just kind of characteristic in African economies, especially the Horn of Africa, but also let's say the whole of Africa, and globally we are seeing that because supply side shocks have been hitting us. Now, when you have supply side shocks and you don't have tools to deal with supply side shocks, you are in a problem, okay? in terms of demand-side shocks, we know what to do in terms using monetary policy tools. But when it comes to supply-side shocks, the immediate solution is bring back the supply. But we know that that cannot happen for two reasons. One, the Russia-Ukrainian crisis is one of the sources of the problems, which is still persisting. Two, the climate change shocks and the drought situation in the Horn of Africa. It means that food supply and energy prices will continue to be high. So one of the solutions, and this is something that I talked more than 10 years ago, or maybe close to more than 10 years ago, was that we have to use demand-side tools so that we tighten monetary policy, raise interest rates to dislodge the plateau of high prices in the hope that in future, once the supply is back in the market, we'll dislodge a plateau of high prices. That is what we can do right now, and we do believe that with the current kind of promising rains, we will see the cost of living or inflation coming down, and that will reduce the cost of living. That's one aspect. But let's also say that we also need to caution politicians who think that the cost of living, there's somebody with a switch that you can lower it, you lower it or raise it. It's not a switch. It's a whole combination of several emergency things that are being done. One, we have budget constraints, and we also have other developmental constraints. You can see drought. Animals are dying in the parks. People have lost their wealth in animals. If you fly in northern Kenya, you are going to see carcasses of animals. So essentially, it's a very devastating consequences which should be a concern to all of us. So in a sense, we are saying the resources that we can get, we try to cushion ourselves to ride over the current shocks. But let's not politicize cost of living, assuming that it is a switch. If anybody can tell me whether you can get a switch, I'll be very happy. Thank you.
Okay, looking at Kenya's debt now, debt policy has been capped to be a percentage of GDP. How will this change Kenya's debt portfolio?
Yeah, debt as a ratio of GDP is an instrument that is or a comparison that is used across countries. But essentially, we need to move to the next level and say, just like inflation, we have a target for inflation, isn't it? The target for inflation in Kenya is 5%, but you are around to oscillate around 2.5%. Now, if it goes to 7.5%, they say it is within the bound. But if it goes beyond 7.5%, it's outside the bound. So what does it tell you? It tells you that it's a signal to lower the inflation rate. It's time to fight the inflation. Now, if it goes below 2.5, if it goes below 5% by 2.5%, you are within the range. But suppose it goes below that. For example, it goes from 2.5% to 2%. It is time to actually relax monetary policy so that deflation will not hit you. So essentially, when you have a target, you can revolve around the target and you can give yourself regions of operation. It's the same thing with debt cap, or we call it in the policy language a debt anchor.
Well, that's all coming in from the East. It's back to you, Akin.
Now, there's a whole lot more to unpack here in West Africa as we delve deep into the aviation matters in Nigeria. CNBC Africa's Kenneth Igboma had a chat with the Regional Vice President for Africa and the Middle East at the International Air Transport Association, Kamil Alawadi, on development and updates around the $743 million trapped airline funds in Nigeria and what this portends. Take a listen.
We've been pushing for about almost over 2 years now, pushing the government of Nigeria to settle the outstanding debt, or not particularly settle, but to take a different position on how they handle the blocked funds. I understand that Nigeria is going through a difficult period right now with foreign exchange, but we have to actually look at the damage that's being compounded because of the blocked funds. And we worked with a number of stakeholders on that in Nigeria, but it's been a roller coaster of a ride.
All right, but looking at what we're seeing play out here, especially now that we're in a political transition here in Nigeria, how do you think this is going to kick that can further down the road?
I'm hopeful that this new government, and with the changes that have occurred, including the central bank governor, I'm hoping that there will be, let's say, fresh eyes looking at an old issue that needs to be fixed urgently. I plan Nigeria soon to actually raise awareness on the damage that this will cause to the aviation industry and effectively the GDP down the road. So I'm hoping that this is a good opportunity to start off once again.
Yeah, because on the side of the airlines, we've seen previously some airlines suspending their operations to Nigeria because of the challenges that it caused for them, but in your conversations with the airlines, how are they taking the challenges here, and how hopeful are they that this can be resolved?
Yeah, so and that's a good question, huh? So when you consider what the airlines have gone through in the past 3 years, okay, they've pretty much burnt up all their extra cash. They're on expensive loans right now, trying to regenerate some form of cash that they could keep in cases where, like the war that is occurring right now between Russia and stuff like that. All these things impact the airlines, so they need to have a little bit of cash to continue operating. And because of COVID, this impacted the airlines' cash availability. And each airline handled it differently. Some had to resell their aircraft or refinance their aircraft, or whatever the case may be. That means that airlines can't afford to take additional risks or wait for their cash to come back in. So, if you're an airline, you sold millions of dollars worth of tickets in Nigeria, and you've been waiting 2, 3, or 4 years for your money to come back, this is biting the airlines, profits, and effectively they have to find alternative ways to fund the next flight. Airlines are looking at Nigeria very closely, and at some point, this whole situation will break aviation in Nigeria.
Moving on, we unpack a new UNICEF report which shows that 190 million children in 10 African countries are at the highest risk from a convergence of 3 water-related threats of inadequate water sanitation and hygiene, related diseases, and climate hazards. Ruben Ombayiha, Regional Advisor for Water Sanitation and Hygiene Program at UNICEF's West and Central Africa, tabled the task ahead as the world engaged at the UN Water Conference in New York. Take a listen.
As you rightly say, this is really a very important issue we are dealing with, and now that we would like to really highlight where the threats are and how we can, what we can do, to overcome them. Let's just say this report on the triple threat, or one can say also the triple burden, it's defined as the convergence of low level of safe water, sanitation, and hygiene services, high rates of child death, under 5 child death from water-related diseases, and exposure to climate environmental risks. So you have these 3 factors combined, which really, when you look at the countries where we look at the countries we work in the world, more than 190 countries, and when we combine all these threats, and you look at the countries which have, on the first one, less than 50% of access in water and sanitation services. You look in the second threat, the countries which are like the top 20 in the highest burden of water and related diseases to children under 5. And on the third one, you look at the 25% countries which are highest risk, facing the highest risk on climate change, according to UNICEF Children Risk Index. When you combat all these, you will find 10 countries, and which are all in Africa, 9 of them in West and Central Africa, and 1 in the Horn of Africa, which is Somalia. So we can see really where the threats are and where we are lagging behind in terms of investment to face the situation and bring everybody up to speed, moving forward the SDGs in 2030.
Yes.
I like the fact that you've also brought into the scope of discussion the SDG 6, for example, the implementation of the SDG 6 Global Acceleration Framework. Your thoughts around how we've been able to implement this, and also with the increase in security concerns, conflicts. Take, for example, West Africa. Water facilities have also been the target here. Just last year, we saw over 58 water facilities attacked. This was a bigger number from the 2021 numbers.
Yes, indeed. I mean, because I mean, all these countries we're talking about, the 10 countries, most of them are also facing crisis. I mean, really like security crisis. And I'm sure you were talking in this example about the conflict we're having. We're facing at this time in Burkina Faso, yes, where you will see even the water supply infrastructure becoming a target, becoming part of the conflicts. So that's not only, prevent the country to move forward towards the targets in SDG 6, but also work in eliminating all the progress that were made, previously. So I mean, we are facing a really dire situation in most of these countries, and that's why we think, this is the time. We are 7 years, away from the SDGs, and this is the time you need to take action to make sure that what is needed in terms of government engagement, in terms of the funding, and it also taking into account the climate change risk, yeah, which is affecting those countries. We really need to move fast, and we need to put our all the efforts we have, the government, civil society, yeah, the communities themselves.
Well, that's it from West Africa. Thank you, Palesa and Sarah, for the regional update. Well, that's all we can take this week on the show. Join us same time next week for more weekly business stories across sub-Saharan Africa. I'm Akin Obake. Thank you for watching.